Far too early Philadelphia Eagles 53-man roster predictions, including depth chart predictions, coming up next right here on Locked On Eagles.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. I'm Louie. Today's episode is brought to you by Monopoly Go. I admit it, I've got a competitive side. I think we all do, and it's going to be a big fan of Monopoly Go, the mobile hit twist on classic Monopoly. So join your friends and download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store or Google Play. Once again, thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Louie DiBiase here on a Friday edition of the podcast. One of two podcasts today. Gino and I are going to be recording later on as well as we continue 5 shows a week. Post-2024 NFL Draft. We'll have more draft content for you later on the podcast tonight. But I wanted to do a bonus show. Of course, we were off yesterday, and I was thinking a lot about this roster that the Eagles put together now through free agency and the draft. Like, Howie Roseman has done work. Much busier than he was last year when he kind of just ran it back for the most part when it comes to that roster. There wasn't a lot of change. This year, he made a ton of moves in free agency. He made a ton of draft picks, 9 of them, trading up the board, down, a brand new looking team at many important positions, starting roles, role players. He made a lot of internal contract extensions to Landon Dickerson, DeVante Smith, A.J. Brown, Jordan Mailata. The list goes on and on. And I looked at this roster, and while there's been Eagles teams in the past that on paper I've loved, and they did not come to fruition. 2011. 2015 had hype. Not by me, but people in the offseason were hyping up that team. I'll never forget Adam Schefter picked the Eagles to win the Super Bowl that year, and Sam Bradford would have been the Super Bowl MVP in his eyes, which is hilarious looking back, but it's true. Like, some people loved that roster. I loved the 2019 Philadelphia Eagles. I thought it was the best offense they've ever put together. They won 9 games. But then there's times that it comes to fruition after looking that good on paper. The 2022 Eagles, it's the best team I've ever seen, even over the 2017 Super Bowl champions, from a talent perspective, just from a dominance perspective. And we said that after the draft, like, okay, if Jalen Hurts takes a step, this team's going to be a unit. Jalen Hurts took the step, and they were a unit. I'm feeling like this 2024 roster is going to be like 2022. Could they be like 2019, 2011, 2015? Sure. Could they disappoint like the 2023 Eagles? Yeah, absolutely. But I'm not thinking that's going to happen. I'm feeling very good about the way this team is put together. And even if they don't become a historic franchise team in Philadelphia, like the 2017 Eagles, like 2022, I will say on paper, this is the favorite roster I think I've ever had as an Eagles fan. Like, from a combination of putting together favorite players of mine, the styles of players that I like, what positions they're prioritizing, the youth, the speed. Honestly, 2024 on paper, this is my favorite Eagles team maybe of all time. Not saying that's going to translate on the field, but I think it's going to. I'm feeling really good about it, and I did my 53-man roster predictions, including the depth chart, right after the draft, just out of curiosity of where I think this roster stands, who has what role. I want to get into that on today's edition of the show. Obviously, it's way too early. The Eagles haven't even started. Actually, they're starting this week. Rookie, of course, mini camps, OTA is coming up soon, and training camp. So obviously, it's way too early to predict who's going to be on this roster. The roster's not even done. Howie's always making moves. Very well known to be making moves in the months of May and June after the draft. He already did it, bringing in Mekhi Becton last week, right after the draft on Sunday. So I think the roster's ever-changing, but here is my way too early 53-man roster predictions. Let's start this segment with offense, and we're going to go with quarterback. I'm keeping 3 quarterbacks in this order. Of course, Jalen Hurts, Kenny Pickett, and Tanner McKee. Nothing really crazy here after trading a pretty substantial amount for Pickett. I think he's going to be the backup, although I think Tanner McKee, if it's a fair one-on-one battle in training camp this summer, he could win that battle if it just comes from talent. But I think with what they've invested in Pickett, with his reputation versus McKee, the mobility aspect as well, I think he would fit more the coaches would think that if Hurts went down, they would want Kenny Pickett, who has live game action, with a win now roster over Tanner McKee. So it would be Hurts, Pickett, and McKee. At running back, the Eagles, the past few years, have been keeping 4 running backs. It has not been worth it, like keeping a Trey Sermon or a Rashad Penny, even a Boston Scott at times, like really has not made much sense. I'm going to go back to the old Andy Reid days when the Eagles would keep 3 running backs. I think it's only going to be Saquon Barkley, Kenneth Gainwell, and rookie from Clemson, Will Shipley. Especially with a guy like Saquon, you're not going to rotate as much. Like, this isn't a committee approach like it used to be. I don't think you necessarily need 4 running backs, especially when you have a lot better talent at other more important positions. Like, there's not enough space on this roster to keep 4 running backs, and the talent doesn't really justify it anyway. So I think it's Saquon, Gainwell, and Shipley. If you told me halfway through the year Shipley, though, upended Gainwell as RB2, I wouldn't be surprised. Wide receiver, I'm going to keep 6, and I'm going to have a surprise guy off the roster. He only signed a 1-year deal with no guarantees, and that's DeVante Parker. So I'm keeping A.J. Brown, DeVonta Smith. Wide receiver 3, it's going to be by committee, so I don't want to say there's one entrenched starter, but I'm going to put Ainias Smith as that first guy up at wide receiver 3. Over Parris Campbell, over Johnny Wilson, over Britton Covey. I have Ainias Smith as wide receiver 3, Parris Campbell as wide receiver 4. Johnny Wilson, I think, will beat out DeVante Parker as that bigger receiver, that style player. They'll want to keep Wilson on the roster over Parker. Of course, a rookie, doesn't have the injury history of Parker, has far more explosiveness. Johnny Wilson makes the roster. Britton Covey is wide receiver 6. I did think about maybe keeping 7 and keeping Parker on the roster. I even asked the question, is Covey safe? Like, of course, last year he was one of the most efficient punt returners in the NFL, a Pro Bowler, but you look at the fact that he really doesn't do much as a wide receiver, and the fact that the Eagles brought in a lot of good return options like Cooper DeJean, Ainias Smith. You look at as well at running back Will Shipley. I mean, they've got a lot of good options there. Do they necessarily need to keep Covey versus those players who can make an impact as a returner and they can be more effective on offense and defense? However, I think that would be, when I was thinking that, I don't think I was giving enough credit to Covey just how good he was as a returner in 2023. And so I think some of it could depend on his development as a receiver in training camp, but I think for the most part, he's safe. But it was something I thought about because DeVante Parker, let's say he goes in and has a good training camp and he's a proven former first-round pick, but Johnny Wilson also looks good, and Ainias Smith and Parris Campbell stays healthy, and you don't want to get rid of any of these guys. Like, could you consider Covey the last man out? I can't see it because of how good he was as a returner. I think in that case, you'd probably end up keeping 7 receivers over cutting one of those players. But I think Johnny Wilson beats out DeVante Parker. Only one of Campbell and Parker make the roster. I think the Eagles like Parris Campbell better. They like that 4-3 speed. They want that role as wide receiver 3 with him rotating through with Ainias Smith. And then the big boy, Johnny Wilson. So those are my 6 receivers. I kept 3 tight ends. To be honest, I didn't want to keep anybody outside of Dallas Goedert, but you got to have some bodies at this position. I kept CJ Uzoma, who the Eagles signed right before the draft, and then Alberto. So Grant Calcaterra on the outside looking in that roster battle. I think Alberto is just a better receiver, and I think he's more reliable to stay healthy than Calcaterra. But overall, tight end behind Dallas Goedert continues to be just kind of a tire fire. But it really doesn't matter that much, in my opinion. If Goddard goes down, this is a very wide receiver-heavy team. And with Saquon Barkley in the backfield being a very dependent receiver in the backfield, unlike Miles Sanders was and DeAndre Swift even last year, I think that will help make up for the lack of a true tight end too. Then I kept 10 offensive linemen. Really no surprise here. Jordan Mailata, Landon Dickerson, Cam Jurgens at center. I say Tyler Steen will win the battle at right guard over Becton, over Matt Hennessy, over Tyler Keegan. Lane Johnson is the right tackle. So it's Mailata, Dickerson, Jurgens, Steen, and Lane. And then I do have Becton as the swing tackle. Matt Hennessy is your primary interior backup. And then you kept the rookies as well. Tyler Keegan and Dylan McMahon is your backup center. I also did keep Fred Johnson. I think you need at least 2 tackle backups. So I kept Becton and Johnson because Hennessy's not a tackle. Neither is Keegan. Neither is McMahon. He's an undersized center. So I think you had to keep Fred Johnson as well. So those are the 10 offensive linemen I kept in that order for the depth chart. So overall, I kept, 12, 22, 25 offensive players. Who did I keep on the defensive side of the ball? What does the depth chart look like heading into 2024? I'll get into that coming up next, right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by Monopoly Go. Game off. We got to pause here to talk about such a fun game. I know what you're saying. Flag on the play. You already talked about that, but there's just so much good stuff in this game. In Monopoly Go, you can team up with your friends for timed tournaments where you work together to build up each other's boards. The more you win together, the more awesome prizes that you unlock. And there's so much to get. You can get unique stickers, which you can then trade with your friends to complete albums for big prizes, cool new playing pieces to travel the boards with, hilarious emojis for taunting friends when you smash their buildings or heist their vaults. Plus, Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every day with constantly changing tournaments and challenges. A ton, including their own unique mini games like digging for treasure or a robot pachinko machine. There's always new timed events that help you win big. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go, so get off the bench and go download it now. Free on Google Play or the App Store. Game on. Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Guys, you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Have to turn down the volume with all that shouting and those hot takes? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all that screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Far too early depth chart and 53-man roster predictions on today's edition of Locked On Eagles. One of two shows. Gino and I have some more draft content for you later on today. Let's continue on with defense as I roll through these predictions. I kept 5 edge rushers in this order based on snap count and usage because all 4 guys, 4 of 5, will be heavily involved in a rotation. The number 1 guy, Josh Sweat. Number 2, Bryce Huff. Nolan Smith will be that 3rd guy. Hopefully he takes a big step. So it's kind of 1A, 1B, 1C between Sweat, Huff, and Smith. The snap count with those 3, if Smith takes that step, I think will be very similar, especially with Huff and Smith. I think Josh Sweat, because of the run defense, will be the most relied upon player at this position. Huff and Smith, very similar styles. I think they'll be number 2 and 3. Brandon Graham's your 4, and then Jalix Hunt is your 5. I kept overall 10 defensive linemen, 5 defensive tackles as well. Jalen Carter and Jordan Davis and Milton Williams. The torch has been passed. Fletcher Cox, Jordan Hargrave, they're gone. It's time for the kids to step up. Carter, Davis, and Milton Williams. Sink or swim time. This entire position is young because then I also kept Marlon Tuipulotu as your main backup to Jordan Davis, and then Moro Ijomo, who I like and actually think he could take a step this year and maybe start rotating through with Milton Williams as like that, second pass rushing defensive tackle. So those are my 10 defensive linemen. I kept 5 more traditional inside linebackers. Nakobe Dean and Devin White are your starters. Jeremiah Trotter Jr., though, is going to be knocking on the door if Nakobe Dean does not step up or if he doesn't stay healthy. And if Devin White is a train wreck like he was at the end of last year, Jeremiah Trotter could get on the field sooner rather than later. Then, of course, we've got Orlean Burks from the San Francisco 49ers last year. He's going to be one of your primary backups, and then Ben Van Sumeren for special teams. So those are my 5 linebackers. Corner is where it got tricky. So I did cut James Bradberry. My starters are going to be Quinyon Mitchell and Darius Slay. I put Avonte Maddox as the 3rd corner, but Avonte is not safe, number 1. His roster spot's not safe, and his starting slot job isn't safe either, because I think when they have 5 defensive backs out there, they're going to want Cooper DeJean out there, I think, over Maddox with CGJ and Reed Blankenship at safety. They might even want Sidney Brown when he's healthy out there over Avonte Maddox. So I think Avonte he's still going to play, right? And especially when they have like 6 defensive backs out there, Cooper DeJean's not going to just be a primary slot corner. I think he's going to move all across the formation like a Brian Branch or a Kyle Hamilton would in Detroit and Baltimore. So Avonte Maddox will have a role if he makes the roster. But I do think Cooper DeJean is going to be the primary, 3rd, quote-unquote, corner, if you will. CGJ can also play in the slot, too, so he's not safe. And then your main backups, Keely Ringo, Isaiah Rodgers, and Eli Ricks. I listed Cooper DeJean as a safety here, so they can keep an extra corner. So my safeties are Chauncey Gardner-Johnson and Reed Blankenship. Then I kept Cooper DeJean and then Sidney Brown when he does get healthy. So, yeah, I cut James Bradberry. I think Avonte Maddox might not be safe, but I think they do want slot options. They saw last year when Maddox went down that they needed some help, and they had to bring in a Bradley Roby and force James Bradbury inside or Eli Ricks, and just nothing that they did worked. So I think they would want to keep Maddox, even if he's not the primary starter that he used to be, and I don't think he will. They don't want to rely on him as much. I think it's going to be DeJean and CGJ a lot, but Maddox, I think, will have a role in the slot there. So those are my 4 safeties, my 6 cornerbacks, and then, of course, your big 3 of Elliott, Mann, and Lovato at special teams. Overall, like that one was, I think, a lot. The roster in general was pretty easy to decipher, even with like who stays, how many players at each position. I don't think there was really anybody on the bubble that I cut and I'm like, oh my gosh, like that might be a huge mistake. Even the starting jobs that are open. At corner, like, even if James Bradbury's on this roster, I don't foresee a scenario where Quinyon Mitchell's a red shirt sitting on the bench. Like, you want Quinyon Mitchell on the field this year. I don't think there's any way, and if they do, it's a problem. If they go out there and with Darius Slay, Avonte Maddox, and James Bradbury as their starters again, to me that either means the young guys didn't take a step this summer and something went really wrong with Quinyon Mitchell, or the Eagles are just playing it safe, and I really hope that they don't do that. A conservative approach in the secondary will get you in the kind of situation that you were in last year. You're going to look old and slow and injury ravaged, and I do not want that. They have options now. They're all young and unproven. That's especially the theme with this defense, young and unproven ability. But man, is their talent, man, is their potential, and I'm really excited to see what this young unit can do in 2024. What starting jobs are the least safe? I want to get into that coming up next as we roll through this Friday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. It's winner-take-all time in the NBA and the NHL. The playoffs are heating up. FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 back in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 back to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. So visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count, because unfortunately the Philadelphia 76ers did not. I'm sorry, this team is like the Dallas Cowboys of the, and I'm sorry about that comparison, but it's true. They're the Dallas Cowboys of the NBA. They just keep losing in the first and second round. So make sure you win big with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Louie DiBiase, we're wrapping up this Friday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. Way too early, 53-man and depth chart predictions for the Philadelphia Eagles in 2024. Honestly, maybe my favorite roster on paper. Again, the Eagles drafted so many of my guys like Quinyon Mitchell, Cooper DeJean, Johnny Wilson, Jeremiah Trotter. That's such a fun angle of this team. They're young, they're fast, they're exciting on both sides of the football. They are going to score a ton of points. They have so many weapons. I don't know. I love the makeup of this team. I love the personalities on both sides. I like the moves at coordinator. I'm still skeptical of Nick Sirianni long term, but overall, I think this team is really exciting. And let me know what you thought of my predictions for the depth chart for the 53-man roster. What would you have done differently? Of course, this is ever changing. It's May 3rd when I'm doing this. These predictions are absolutely going to change as the months go on. But that's my like right after the draft initial thoughts about the way this roster looks. When I went through this, like the starting jobs that I looked at, because this is a really good team, right? I mean, this is a team that's pretty set. It's in a win now mode. They got stars at almost every spot, or at least very good players. There's not a lot of starting jobs open. There's a lot of roles to be filled, and they need to upgrade from what happened last year at certain spots, like cornerback for sure. But I went through and was like, okay, what jobs are the least safe after I did this? Like, which ones were the hardest to decide? And I'll say, I don't know if anything was like really hard for me to figure out, but I'll say I thought right guard was definitely one of the positions I said, oh, this isn't obviously this guy. I think Tyler Steen is clearly the betting favorite, and I'm a big Tyler Steen guy. I think he's going to be good this year. I keep remembering what Lane Johnson said last summer about how he gives him Brandon Brooks vibes, and that excites me. And I was very impressed during the preseason when Jeff Stoutland asked him to play so many different positions on the offensive line, and I thought he handled it really well. And he played only a few times last year in spots at right guard. I thought he handled that well as well. So Tyler Steen's going to be the right guard, in my opinion. Howie Roseman mentioned they're excited about him. They didn't draft a lineman early. However, you do have Becton, who Jeff Mosher said they want to try at guard. You do have Hennessy, who last year was in line to start at right guard or center, I believe. I'm not sure which one for the Atlanta Falcons. You have a couple rookies like Tyler Keegan, who played for the national champs in Michigan. So they do have options for sure. I think Steen's the guy, though, there. And then slot defensive back was another one. I'm like, Avonte Maddox could get cut. If he makes the roster, he could start and bounce back into 2022 form if he stays healthy. Or he could be a bench guy with Cooper DeJean being the inside defensive back they use the most, with them going matchup based between him and Chauncey Gardner-Johnson, kind of rotating those guys in and out. Or Isaiah Rodgers could develop and translate to the slot well. He's a boundary corner for the most part, but I think that his skills could translate well to the slot. Eli Ricks played there last year. So did James Bradbury even a little bit. I mean, Maddox is not safe, but at the same time, he is good when he plays inside. Cooper DeJean, I don't know what role they want for him. Maybe they want him to be the slot corner. Maybe they want him to be the star or play safety or be a boundary corner. I'm not sure. So in that way, that's where it was a little difficult. I don't think it's not black and white like this guy's the starting slot. These are your safeties. I think Vic Fangio is going to use these guys like chess pieces. Sidney Brown coming in too is going to switch up the equation. Like when he's healthy, I think he's going to have a role on this team. Like his speed and range you want out there. This is a guy you developed last year and invested a third-round pick in, and I think he's got great traits to be a big-time role player for this defense. And then I think Mike Linebacker was the other one. I'm like, okay, this could be something that if Jeremiah Trotter Jr. starts to turn heads and Nakobe Dean is just okay or he gets hurt again or just isn't popping, like that's the other position, linebacker. And I don't mean to single out Nakobe Dean. It could also be Devin White. But if one of those two guys are struggling, I could see Jeremiah Trotter Jr. grabbing a starting job. So I'd say right guard, linebacker, and slot defensive back. Those are the positions that this training camp, I think the coach is going to say, may the best man win. I think those three spots, slot corner, linebacker, right guard. That's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. Thanks so everybody for making us your first listen each and every day. Gino and I will be back later on today, so one more show for you 5 days a week. We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. As always, thanks so much for downloading, watching, and listening, and let's go Birds. Fly, Eagles, fly.